to understand the purpose for which man was created, and then the tragedy of disobedience to God's commands. So we're literally looking at from chapter 2, which is the new creation account, the temptation, man's fall, and then also working towards the creation of a new nation. Okay, so I think if you've read the notes, you'll see that Genesis and 1, they look just so dissimilar. Again, as we looked last week, I said, understand that the writer, this is a theological book. There is theological truth in here that he wants to dispense or teach. So when we look, that is what we're looking for mainly. It's not necessary to put the accounts together. Each account presents a new theological truth concerning God and the creation. Alright? And in creation we talk about inanimate moon, sun, stars, which is governed by laws of nature. Then you have animate, which is the animals, which is guided by their instincts and impulses. Then you have man, which is very distinct. And we said that the theological truth that he wants to draw out here is just to show you how they stand in relationship to each other, God, man, and the inanimate and animate objects. And also to show God's will, his nature, his purpose, especially man's purpose in God's plan for creation. Alright, so this is maybe where the second part of the creation account comes in. In Genesis 1, you have creation account number 1. Here the emphasis is God, like I said, creator. Man is part of his creation. I said after so. Therefore, man in relation, here the emphasis is man in relation to the created world. Then you have the second creation account. In this one, the emphasis changes because man is the center of the creation, of the account of creation. Here also we see an emphasis on the creation of a garden, trees, animals, and woman who stands in the relationship to man again. In this case, we talk about man and woman. Okay? Therefore, in the second account, it's man in relation to God and his plan, as opposed to one, man in relation to the created world. Now, the intent of this writer is not to reconcile the two accounts. Okay? His intent is very clear. He's going to explain man's purpose in God's design for creation. Hoekom is ek hier? Ek wil daai vraag beantwoord. This explanation also lays a foundation then for understanding the tragedy of man's disobedience and separation from God as recorded in chapter 3. We said man is made from dust, which is created matter. God created matter. It's not coexistent with God. It's separate from God. God stands over and above all of his creation. Therefore, he is related to the rest of creation. He is dependent. Like every part of creation, sun, moon, stars, animals, he is dependent. Ground, as we see in 2 verse 7, verse 19, and also chapter 1 verse 20, ground is Adama. Okay, dust. And man is Adam.
So that means Eve was Adama. It is from dust.
It's a stuff. He is distinct from all other living creatures. Why? Because God personally shapes him. Personally and carefully shapes him. God breathed into man the breath of life. He is the highest being in God's order. He also has a personality as opposed to animals. Thereafter he creates the garden, because now we see he creates Adam, and in the first you saw a waterless mess, apparently this waterless mess, and then in chapter 2 you see a creation, but very barren again, because now you see earth and land, but it's barren because it seems like the vegetation now is created afterwards, but this was placed there by God, so that in that garden, there with God, because that's the place of God, according to the word now. That's the place where God resides, and that's where we are supposed to reside, in his presence actually. So Eden is eintlik symboliek van sy presence. And there we may have a relationship with him, there we may have fellowship with him. But there's two trees here that we also find within the garden, besides the normal fruit trees and stuff that he provides for food and beauty. There's also the other two trees, one which is the tree of life. And the first tree simply signifies that eternal life is not inherent to man. It's also Eternal life is not inherent to man, but eternal life is also conditional, based on continual fellowship with man, with God. And man had access until he sinned and consequently was separated from God. Tot hy gesondig het. And the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the tree of knowledge of good and evil is more than just what we call intellectual perception. Lewe werk jy andersom nie. Soos ek sê die tweede een, maar ek sê it includes experience, and that experience he partakes in that when he exercises his freedom to choose and he exercises dominion. Nou is dit anders. Nou beleef hy dit. Maar die lewe begin met waarheid, dan experience. Die lewe is nie experience en dan kom waarheid nie. Dit werk nie so nie. Okay. Then also very important, with the tree of knowledge, it also signifies that he is not liberated from the responsibility of doing right. Even though there is a possibility of doing wrong, he is not liberated from the responsibility of doing right. And being dependent on his Creator. Also in the same chapter, we find what we call monogamy. God's design for man here again is that they will have one mate. Man is responsible to his father and mother until he chooses a wife. Net vinnige incident. Thereafter the man's responsibility changed from parents to his wife. He's going to leave, he's going to cleave. And also what he's trying to bring out here is that this is the strongest relationship in human kinship. In the same passage, it says that they were naked and not ashamed, which implies that innocence, not necessarily perfection, but an innocence, a pureness, and a very holy relationship between them and God. Marriage was instituted by God. The serpent and man's fall, and this is Genesis 3:1. So it's a fall of God, but the content remains the same. He cannot do it any other way. What is natural, he wants to make unnatural. What is not perverted, he wants to make perverse. He wants to turn it into something else. So what he does is, and then also very important, note that the serpent is aware of the possibility of pride. That was experienced at the end. He says, fully prepared to tempt you. Hy kom gereed met sy volle wapenrusting. Daarom sê Ephesians 6 vers 3. Temptation also very important, comes from this text also tells you. It comes from outside and within, because in the New Testament God often talks about the lust and the cravings within, the battles we have within. So it starts here, but sometimes it's on the outside also. Sometimes it was mainly on the inside. And so when you see the outside, it just... So there's three things. He says, did God really say? Which insinuates that God is unfair. Remember we spoke about Lucy last week, the movie? Just try and remember what I said to you. Did God really say? Insinuates that God is unfair to limit man's freedom and to keep anything back, anything from man. Remember when Lucy starts getting, when she attains 100% of all knowledge, then she goes back to the first human, touches her to pass on the knowledge. So in effect, she's saying God is unfair to limit man's freedom and to keep back anything from him. And it's confirmed again in the third one when we look at the motives of God. The second way he comes to, he says, you shall not surely die. He questions God's integrity. He questions his truthfulness. You will be like God is the third one. Attacks the motives of God. God is selfish, he says. You're not really like him. You're not really all-knowing. 1 John 2:16 states the very same. It's the lust of the flesh, the desires of the eye, and the pride of life. It always comes the same way. What is natural becomes unnatural or perverted. We want to be free. We want to be subject to no one. That is our cry all the time. That is our understanding of freedom. In chapter 3, 1 to 4, 26, we also see the consequences of sin. There's three. The first one is spiritual. Okay? The guilt that our sin produces results in avoiding God. It implies that man is fully aware that his action separates him from God. This running away actually says, but I do know that it separates me from God. In turn, he chooses to deny the existence of God because I'm not most makkelijker. Who requires responsibility and obedience He even denies the guilt that comes with it. And that is what Jesus died for. Not only your sin, he died for the guilt also, and the shame that comes with it. There's also the blame shifting. And the blame shifting is quite simple. It's not a refusal om te acknowledge dat ons 'n sonde, dat ons sonde erken, dat ons gesonde. We attempt to justify our actions very easily, and human beings can, you don't, yes. That's where they are the cleverest actually. They know how to figure out the reason. Then they can think very well. But blame shifting also refers to if I can put it another way, it's perverted reasoning. Then there's the physical death, or the physical consequences. One which is the pain in childbirth for the woman, and then also now she gets her husband to dominate her. And in some societies, it's actually a very terrible thing. In South America, you have more a maternalistic ethos and Dennis in some of the cities, because the men is just missing. So they are stronger, but that is also abuse. Same thing, he's not present. When het daar is of nie daar is nie, abuse kan van twee maniere kom. Die ouma barbecue en loop weer aan. Dis abuse. And a husband who dominated. Also, man must now toil the soul to make a living. Hy moet nog aan werk. Hy het gewerk in die tyd, but it wasn't a chore. That was the difference. Now it's a chore. Now jy must toil this, want hy moet gaan sweet om sy geld te maak. There is disharmony in the natural order, and life becomes a struggle. There we go, Carol. And it wasn't intended to be that way. So, this is van sin. Ek het nou net gedeel met die spiritual aspect. But handel was a guilt, blame shifting, en hoe dit ons separate van God af. Hoe ons dan uiteindelik is in existence deny. En wat net ek wil ons hier verantwoordelik vat nie. So dis die gees en die hier geactiveer word. And you have a physical consequence of the fall, which is, like I said, is chain at childbirth, a husband who dominates it. He now is making a living of the soul. So there's complete disharmony in the natural order. And they are also physically expelled from the presence of God. No longer in his presence in this effect. Pentateuch. Dit is die worst form of punishment that God complete is for us. Then you also have what we call a sociological aspect or consequence. Often we don't think about it, but just think of the story of Samson, because we don't read the story of Samson that way. And what's the dog's name now? When he told us the story of Samson, he reminded us that sin, if you look at the life of Samson, baie keer lees ons van die Here wat die nasie vir 'n tyd bietjie kies gebring, maar intussen sien jy baie se sonde, en as mense wat sterk as gevolg van die sonde, nou word dit weer ons maar dat ons so bla. Baie mense hoef nie te wees dat as hy dit kon ons nie anders kom van deze ander mense nie werk. In between you have sin, because he says, I want that wife, and from where she from a foreign nation. You're not supposed to do that. He's a Nazareth. So that's net 'n klomp wat hy mis het en hy doen wat hy wil. Sonde affekteer die mense om jou. That's the sociological aspect. Cain kills Abel. So relationships, besides the fact that relationships is marred with God, it's now marred with man, your fellow man. Because remember, God didn't give you dominion over man. He gave you dominion over the animals, over the fish, over the birds. But he never gave you dominion over the wife, because flesh of my flesh, blood of my bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Langsman. So, and because of course, in other words, there's equality when it comes to men and women, or to man in general. There's equality. Ons moet nie so sukkel in die society soos ons nou sukkel nie. Dan moet ons movements begin stig om regte te kry vir vrouens en ons movements stig om die regte te kry en dan. Het moet eintlik nie so wees nie. So this is all the effects of something small like that. He says sin is crouching at your door. In other words, this sociological effect, even though they were affected by Adam's sin, they too had a choice. And that's why before the murder takes place, God says to him, sin is crouching at your door. In other words, you still have time to think about this. You don't have to be so relevant in your actions. Yes, I didn't accept your gift, and there was a reason why I didn't accept your gift. Now, it's very difficult to read that passage because you can't always infer into the Bible what's accepted or not accepted. We can only understand from a biblical point of view that it had to do with his heart. And God was not in heart. So, ons kan net so lees eintlik. So eintlik kon hy anders besluit het, en hy het nie. Sin against our fellow man will be punished. And here we see the first punishment dished out to Adam and Eve. Again, same thing, soil expulsion from the presence of God. God's response to Cain's plea for mercy gives us hope. For while we were yet sinners, sê in vers 5 vers 8 mos, Christ died for us. So he was always thinking about us. And here, early on, we see a man crying out to God for mercy. And God says, yes, I will show you mercy. And he marks him so that nobody else may touch him. And also gives a warning that if anybody touch him, they will suffer sevenfold. Then we have Cain and his descendants. Now, weer eens, but the writer wants to separate the two, because you have Cain and his descendants, and violence follows them. Because your world is concerning. Maar wat het verder gezegd van then in the time of Enoch, you have a descendant of Seth. Enoch, you have a descendant of Seth. And here we may start calling on God. So there's a long time to something for the word that needs to be able to go. It isn't groot val. Mense weet nie hoe om homself te help nie. Tot iemand besluit, hey, maar ek moet eintlik net glo. Ek weet nie hoekom ons gesit het, ek moet net opkyk en loop. The last thing that we have here, or the consequence, is death. And that is physical and spiritual, but we look at that later. Okay? Then just the theological concepts of this first lesson. Man's natural instincts for self-preservation and reproduction are not evil within themselves, but their abuse constitutes sin. In other words, the guy who created the atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the guys who decided and the people who dropped it, that constitutes sin. Not the bomb itself, the making of the bomb necessarily. Unless he knew that it was going to be used for that purpose, I would argue for the latter, that it was sin. Maar een mes is ons, is al brood is iets gebruik as 'n tool om te kry. Jy moet gebruik om dit te steel. So dis die verskil. It's the abuse of whatever is given to you that becomes the problem. Man's natural instincts for self-preservation and reproduction are evil within themselves, but their abuse constitutes sin. Neglect, for example, the reproduction, we can look at babies being sold on the black market, that type of thing, that would be abuse, that would constitute sin. The second theological concept that you need to look at here is the neglect. I wrote this in my own words. Neglect and denial of his spiritual nature and responsibility to God leaves him wide open to deception. The third theological concept that I want you to remember is your instincts must be restrained. Your natural instincts for self-preservation and reproduction must be restrained. And in 2 Corinthians 5:14 it says, the love of Christ controls us. In the same passage in verse 7 it says, we are new creatures. Otherwise, God's commandments for life are forsaken and man is robbed of his uniquely human features which distinguish him from animal creation. When we act unnaturally, that is why some believe that we are dogs, that we will die like dogs, that there's nowhere to go for us, that we are equal to the animate, to the creatures of the field, the wild animals. Soon as God's commandments for life are forsaken, that's where you're going to end up with most of your arguments. Last one is, sin mars our relationship with God and fellow man. So remember, when you sin, it doesn't only affect you and the Lord and your relationship and you possibly running from Him, it also affects your relationship with other people. It affects the way you produce work. It affects the outcomes of a lot of things. Now, Genesis 5, verse 1 to 11 and 9. And it's to understand that sinful man is incapable of delivering himself and must look to a merciful, redeeming God for reconciliation. Now, in the very first chapter of this section, there's what we call the genealogy, and they serve a dual purpose. Alright? The first purpose there is to connect Adam with Noah. And the second one is to show that all mankind is involved in sin as a result of Adam's sin. So everybody is affected, as we said in the previous lesson. There's the sociological aspect to sin. It affects everyone. Emphasis is placed on Seth as the ancestor of God's people. And in this case, Cain is excluded because just before chapter 5 and chapter 4, you have a little bit of a genealogy with Cain. And so they contrast, they kind of contrast the two to say that the one was led to violence and death, while the other was a forerunner of God's people, or an ancestor of God's people. So Cain is excluded from this genealogy because of sin. A life without God, when violence and death would be a natural outcome. Seth means God has appointed, and out of his line comes the recognition of man's dependence on God. Because out of his line you have Enoch, who calls on God, who walks with God. So then men start calling on God. Right? Noah, you also have coming out of his line Noah, which means rest. And then the call to Abraham. So all the genealogies lead up to this. Now there is some argument that these genealogies actually extends over a period of time, so they only show families, not necessarily individuals. That's just one of the arguments that is presented. Seth and his descendants, up until Noah, it seems, except for Enoch, who walked with God and taken to heaven without dying, and an extraordinary long life. 700 to almost 1,000 years. The longest was 963. Methuselah. Contrast this with the genealogy of Shem after the flood, Noah's son. Dan sien jy hoe gaan hy van 500 af na 200. Degeneration. And that is how, today for example, we say that the diseases are carried over by DNA. The flood, an introduction to the flood, which starts in Genesis 6, 1 to 9 to 9. It's quite a lengthy. It actually comprises 4 chapters, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Now, the early accounts of the flood date back to the beginning of at least 1,500 years before Genesis was written, according to the traditional date. They want to work it back. The author used the oral tradition of an early historical event for theological purposes, and we call that the account of the Gilgamesh epic. Because remember, besides this account, there's also other accounts in other cultures at the time which still exist in writing, which are all similar to what our accounts are not exactly. In their accounts, you have more than one god, for example, or the gods were satisfied, or the people who, in the Gilgamesh epic, the people who got saved, for example, if that was Noah, they eventually became gods again. So there's lots of variances in the stories. So the author uses the oral tradition of an early historical event for theological purposes once again. He was reporting history, however he was teaching about divine judgment and grace. And he showed that the only hope for sinful man is God's plan of redemption revealed through Abraham and his descendants. Now in the same chapter, we have an interesting thing regarding the sons of God and daughters of men, which we will look at quickly. However, here again, the purpose was to explain the existence either of a gigantic race to emphasize the increase of violence and corruption pre-flood. But there's two possible interpretations to explain the existence of a gigantic race. It says one, that the sons of God may have been young men of royal or noble birth who married the daughters of men. Look at this gewone mense nou. Who were beautiful, though sinful women, perhaps from Cain's line. So the men might have been from Cain's line. The other possible interpretation is that Elohim is a generic word relating to a genus of type, which may be more descriptive for the being of God than the proper name of God. The king was called Son of God by virtue of his office. The same with us, we are called sons of God. We from his work. Sons of God. You're a son of God, actually. Kan jy nou daar stil staan nie? Angels were called sons of God by virtue of their nature. They were Elohim beings, and their nature was related to their function of being sent on a mission by Elohim. Can you see how similar the New Testament idea is also? It says in John 1, verse 12, when we believe, we get the power to become sons of God. And that sons of God was also sent. Like we have been sent. So it's that idea, a similar idea. In other words, the sons of Elohim were beings of the heavenly court who married the daughters of men. In other words, it was angels who actually came down. Which was a strange thing because they don't tell us that angels are physical beings, but we have nothing in the word to prove that or disprove that. So we accept that they are spirit beings. You also have the judgment and the covenant that follows, that is described during the flood period. And in verse 4, which indicates giant men inhabit the earth, verse 5 tells us that the wickedness of men were increasing, and that is why there's this two interpretations. That it was not necessarily giant men, but rather referring to how big and great the wickedness was on the earth at that particular time. En maar fyn lees die skrywers. Judgment is expressed in verse 7 of chapter 6. However, just in the verse thereafter, verse 8 and 9, you have one man with his family actually was declared righteous. So it can't be Noah alone, because God says the whole family. So die familie moes dan reggeleer het in die oor van God, maar hulle sê die Noah, want hy is die hoof van die huis, hulle is dan so beskryf in baie tyd. So Noah is declared righteous by God. And the theme of redemption is continued by focusing on Noah and his descendants. Noah is not necessarily perfect. But why they say Noah is righteous? And I think the same idea also in the New Testament, when you talk about a Christian that's walked a while, then we think of somebody who should be mature. We think of somebody that should be loyal and complete in their allegiance to God. So that's what's being described when they say he's righteous. Iemand wat mature was, loyal was, and complete is in their allegiance to God. If you go to the book of Hebrews, then it says, in chapter 6, 5, almost at the end, where it says, some of you should have been teachers by now. In other words, you should have been mature now, so you shouldn't have been falling away. There is a covenant between Noah and God in 6 verse 18. And the covenant is written in very simple form here. God would save Noah and his family from destruction in the flood, and Noah was to obey his commandments. So dis die eerste keer wat ons sien, 'n covenant sien. In 6:22, it says Noah was to obey the commandments of God. And you will see this type of thing right through the Old Testament, especially when it comes to Moses, God giving him the law. You'll always see at the end of certain chapters, and Moses did as what God commanded him to do. All the Israelites did as Moses commanded them to do, because that's part of the covenant. Then the actual flood starts happening. This is where we have the discrepancy of either bringing 7 pairs of animals or bringing 2 of every sort. However, if you go to chapter 7, then you'll see it refers to clean and unclean animals, which he later uses actually to offer sacrifice. So I don't think so much as discrepancy if you look at the fact that it was clean and unclean that he had to bring in, and then the others which was 2 by 2 rather. 7 verse 4 speaks of a 40-day rain, while 7:24 indicates a 150-day rain period. Here again, conservative scholars point out that the latter reference does not state that it actually rained for 150 days. So if you go into the text, you won't actually see that it says that. And therefore we may argue the latter. They say it's true the other way. But because it said that's 40 days, and because it doesn't state it in the second passage, the argument actually becomes stronger. Because now I've got 2 reference points, as opposed to 1 when they say it's 150 days. I use 2 verses to speak to each other. The flood shows that the order was established at creation, now broke down into ruin. As sin disrupted the natural harmony of creation in the Garden of Eden, so the sin in the days of Noah caused the foundations of the great deep to break up. Jy sal gereeld sien in die skrif hoe as hulle van God praat, dan skud die aarde. Die aarde beweeg af. It is almost like he's also wanting to say something to God. Amper so by jou kan die beweging kom. Maar in die geval, it's busy. It's also going to ruin. Like man has gone to ruin because of sin, so the world, the natural world of this, is also affected by sin. In Romans says, die wêreld loop uit. Die wêreld loop uit. Hy kruiseer, hy verlang ook soos die seuns van God om tot sy volle reg te kom. Still, the purposes of God was not defeated because of man. Not defeated. Because of one man, because of one man and one family that found favor with God. He and his family would know God's blessing. A new beginning was established through Noah and his family. You see here, breaks down and he rebuilds. He breaks down and he reshapes. But how dying? He's always busy creating. And he always leaves. The second thing I want you to remember is he always leaves a remnant. Hy sal ons nooit heeltemal vergeet. Dis die difference. So die ander hoe anders. En ek dink as jy na Moses kyk en Moses verhouding met God, hy herinner hom aan dit. En ons moet dit min. Ek dink it's not a set of abuse, but I think that's what he promised us. And that's part of the relationship that God gives strength to the relationship. He's promised himself. Now that the covenant is established, let's talk about this covenant and its sign. Noah, immediately after the rain stops, he's now sent out the dove, he finds land, he stops, he gets off from Mount Ararat, he takes some of the clean animals, and he builds an altar to the Lord and offers it as a sacrifice to him. And God, in his mercy, responds to this act of worship by vowing never again to destroy earth because of man's sake. And that's why, wherever you go, even through the prophets, when the nation of Israel was time and again was invaded by other nations, there's always a remnant left. Always. Verse 8, chapter 8:21 reveals that this act of Noah did not mean that the punishment of the flood caused any basic change to man. Okay? You with me? No? Okay. is an individual standing with God, making an individual offering on his behalf, from his side and for his family, obviously, at this stage. God's covenant with Noah is explained in chapter 9, verses 1 to 17. Contained in this passage is the covenant between God and the whole earth. That's from 9 to 17 only. And the writer here says, Viertel says, this was a covenant of pure grace. It was universal and it was eternal. We will get to that part now. We will see that it's eternal. And guess what? Here the original creation blessing in chapter 128 is repeated again. You'll see how God constantly repeats and reminds his people of the promises he makes to them, that he will not leave them destitute. Noah and his family was to replenish the earth. It says, for Adam and Eve, go and replenish, multiply and replenish the earth. Here the same thing is advocated again by God to his people. It was an everlasting covenant, with the rainbow as the sign of his covenant. If you see the clouds, you see the rainbow in the clouds, then know that I will never send another flood to our land. In this relationship, God promises to bless man. Man would in turn obey and worship the Creator. It's that simple sometimes. When it comes to the list van die covenant, which is eintlik is dit so klein soms. God assumes responsibility to refrain from annihilating man or destroying sinful man, to provide for him and protect him. So when we faithless, you see the word? He is faithful. He never stops being God. God upholds his promises even when man fails him. The account of the flood reveals that God is righteous and requires justice for transgressing his law, so that the flood equals punishment. He will punish sin. That is the end of story. Sin will not go unpunished. In Ezekiel it says, the soul that sinneth, it will die. Thus soul punishment is. The promise in 128 is upheld. Noah and his family would replenish the earth, and is a manifestation of God's sovereignty. When he says something, he will do it. His dealings with Noah and his family, the establishment of the covenant relationship, reveals that God is merciful and loving, absolutely merciful and loving. And just shortly after that, follows the curse upon Canaan. Here we have Ham with his shameful behavior. Noah is drunk, he's wearing his tent, he's half naked. His son comes in, looks upon his father, then goes and tells his brothers. And they say, "Wonderful." So he goes and tells his brother, and there's a sonde. The other brothers go in backwards and they go and cover their father's nakedness. It meant that Ham, because of his behavior, and his descendants would be degraded to the lowest position of servitude among the brethren of the Israelite nation. And the theme of punishment as a reward for sin is continued again. Shem would rule over Canaan, and along with Japheth would receive a blessing. And I just want to stop here quickly, because here already you have notions of what we call birthright and blessing. Because wie is die eerste seun?
Seun.
Dis altyd die eerste. Birthright. Die birthright en die blessing saam. En dis moeilik soms dis dat dit geskryf kan word, want dis ons is net wie dit sal kry in elk geval. Alhoewel die wet so geskryf is, dis wat God sal die se hart is reg om dit te ontvang. In chapter 10, and this is just before you get chapter 11, you start seeing the universality of what we call judgment. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Almal van ons. In chapter 10, the author uses an ancient document, like I said, to show God's intended purpose and plan in history. In chapter 11, 1 to 9, he highlights the futility and emptiness of human effort and the judgment of God against those who try and exalt themselves above him. You have the Tower of Babel here, which is a symbol of man's pride and defiance. It's constructed in the land of Shinar, and it's also called what we call a ziggurat. one of the cigarettes which served as temples for the deities in Mesopotamia. But the Tower of Babel also served as a symbol of the ruthless powers and oppression of the empires that existed in that region. They wanted to make their own name great instead of magnifying the name of God and giving glory to Him. And that's not new only at that time. That thing continues. If you go to Daniel's time, you had the Babylonians. It was huge. Then they divided into the Medes and Persians, which is only two nations still huge. It's only after that they become smaller. Then you get to the time of the Romans, you get to the time of Constantinople, same kind of idea. Hitler, same kind of idea. They want to take over the world. They are ruthless in their power and oppression of the empires. So, you will see that through the ages, what I'm teaching you here never stops. It never changes. Man thinks he has changed, but he hasn't. There's nothing new under the sun. The Tower of Babel was a proud attempt on the part of man to create unity and strength. And this is what I said, just hold on. Think of the UN. Think of the European Union that's also falling flat now. You have SADC in our region that never works together in any case. They just established the body, but they're not really working together. There's this idea that out of their own strength, out of their own wisdom, they can create unity and strength and then leave God out of it. But under the judgment of God, it came a place of confusion. This is Bible, resulting in the scattering of the people on the face of the earth. En dis die mooiste stukkie daar wat daar in daai vers was. With the pouring out of the Holy Spirit. On Pentecost in Acts 2:5 to 7, this case was reversed. Then men spoke to the nations about the mighty works of God in their own language, unity and strength. But that is because God manifested Himself. There you see true unity, you see true strength, you see it in pure form. When God manifests Himself, when we don't leave Him out of it. Theological concepts. It's very simple. There's the universality of God. Again, the writer is trying to emphasize that the religion in itself is monotheistic. There's a use of indirect evidence rather than direct evidence. And it begins with the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, God. And based on the doctrine of creation. This doctrine logically implies that God is the creator of all men, and therefore men of all nations are required to worship Him. The Old and New Testament are books of God's revelation given to one nation for all men. The genealogies of Genesis 5 and to 10 point to the common relation of all nations and to the universality of the Creator. The neglect of the Bible by contemporary societies is manifested by an exaggerated emphasis on nationalism.